This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Aaron, tell me about your trip. What was the most interesting thing or favorite thing that you consumed while on your trip?
I didn't consume anything terribly interesting, but what was interesting about it was the cheapness and the deliciousness of these staple meals. So when you're walking along this trail, you do about 19 miles a day.
Where are we?
We are starting in Portugal, in the city of Porto, near the Atlantic coast, and walking north into Spain, into a city called Santiago de Compostela. As you're walking, there are many places on the roadside called albergues, where you stay for €10, $12, $13. And there are many restaurants that offer pilgrim's meals. And if you verify that you're a pilgrim, and imagine, this is my pilgrim's passport. I bought it. I'm holding up my copy of the Federalist. This is my pilgrim's passport. I bought it for €2 at the cathedral. I show it, and they know that I'm a pilgrim. Of course, anyone could buy one of these. But the huge army backpack that my veteran brother gave me, the fact that I look very haggard and dirt covered probably helps. You go and they ask you if you want chicken, fish, or pork, and you get a whole fish, a huge thing of fried potatoes, salad, rice, a drink, which can be water, soda, or wine. And then you get a coffee only at the end. If you ask for the coffee to begin with, which I always do, because in America we drink coffee before meals and after meals. They only drink coffee at the end of the meals. You won't get your coffee. €10 everywhere, standard. You will get the same thing everywhere. And it's delicious. We're by the coast, so fresh fish. They don't do processed, packaged, frozen over there. So everything you can expect is fresh and delicious and cheap. My first night there, you'll like this. My first night there, I ordered what I thought, to celebrate the end of a hard first day. I had landed on no sleep, been up for 24 hours in Porto, started walking, did 15 miles that day to stay for €10 in a monastery that was 1,000 years old. Walked down the street to the restaurant, ordered what I thought was a €10 glass of wine, $12, $13 glass of wine, pretty good. They brought out a bottle, and it was delicious.
And you're by yourself.
I'm by myself. I had as much as I could, put a cork in it, and brought it back to the hostel. I made a lot of friends that way.
Yeah.
You see the same people over and over again, even if you don't stay in the same places. I spent my entire second day walking with an Italian young man named Emanuele, who is going on to study runology at some university in Norway in October. We talked and walked all day. And then we said goodbye, and I walked on, and then I saw him the next night, and the next night, and then we were standing in line waiting to go to the cathedral in Santiago to go to Mass and to kiss the relics of St. James. I saw him in line. Hadn't seen him in days, but he was there. So the food was delicious. I mean, this is real home cooking in every restaurant across the way. The wine was cheap and delicious, and you don't feel bad about having potatoes, pork, rice, salad, and at least a carafe of wine every night, because then you're walking 18 miles the next day. And it's a beautiful country.
So was that the average you walked per day?
And I did 170 miles in 9 days.
Wow, that's fantastic.
I walked alone the first 3 days. Nancy joined me afterward. It was amazing. And I feel energized. I'm awake. It's nice to be back in DC. There really is no place like home, but yeah, I feel good.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad that you were able to do it. That's fantastic. So I think now we can return to our study of the Federalist Papers, with Federalist Papers 24 and 25 as our goal today. You got to remember, Federalist Paper number 23 is about the necessity of a government at least as energetic as the one proposed. We need an energetic government in order to preserve the Union. Publius has taught us the necessity of a union. Now we are to understand the necessity of an energetic government in order to preserve that union. That union is essential to our safety and our liberty. 23 laid out specific components of that energy regarding the military, the power to raise funds and direct that military. And now Publius is going to continue to discuss that component of his argument for preservation of the Union. Namely, we must be able to raise armies. The concern then is whether or not that's safe for liberty. So here's the question. An army could rob me of my liberty. The absence of an army could rob me of my security necessary for my liberty. So Publius has to square that circle. It's one with which he's been wrestling for several papers thus far. In particular, you might remember Federalist paper number 8. I think that's worth keeping in mind, especially by the time we get to Federalist 25. Namely, that if the states themselves have to raise their own armies, there's going to be serious problems. The states will start to behave like, for instance, European countries behave. So we're going to hear a little bit more of the same in terms of a national government capable of directing the Army and the Navy for the sake of securing the Union. But here it's going to be a little bit different. I find especially Fed 24 quite polemical. The rhetoric here is pretty tough. But we're going to be dealing with some human being who's hearing other objections. So rhetorically, the tone is, I think, quite different in 24 than what we would have seen in some of those single-digit papers that were advancing somewhat similar arguments. So Aaron, man, great to see you yet again. What do you think of my opening salvo on these papers? What would you like to do with them?
You told us that we're going to meet someone who's going to hear an objection. Before we get into what that objection is, the rhetoric you said is different. And what I think what Publius is drawing us here is an education of the person reading in the newspapers, what we would call the anti-federalists, and Publius, and understanding how to react to the different objections. Because it sounds like Publius takes very seriously, even as he takes it apart, this objection, that proper provision has not been made against the existence of standing armies in time of peace. Now, it's an objection which I shall now endeavor to show rests on weak and unsubstantial foundations. He goes on to explain in general why it's wrong, and then the paper is spent in the first half of it saying why that's so. Yet we meet this guy who is meeting this objection, and he helps us understand how we can be guarded against the specious declamations against the Constitution. So if we're reading this now, we can understand how the Constitution protects us against a standing army and how the Constitution is able to protect our liberties from too weak of a government. And at the same time, I think this provides us an education for how we can be attuned to political debate. So this is a paper, Mike, it seems to me, relevant beyond the issue which it addresses, namely the objection presented about the Constitution not making adequate provision for a standing army. So as students of politics, as citizens, this paper has a lot to teach us, I think.
Yeah, I thought you were almost going to say as students of politics and also students of pedagogy and persuasion, because this is an argument I've made elsewhere regarding what effect does it have on a reader or a listener when another person is being corrected, when a third party is being corrected or raises an opinion that's then being corrected. So you're not directly talking to me, but I'm watching you talk to someone else about another opinion. So there's something about this, a stranger to our politics, whom Publius introduces in paragraph 3 of Federalist paper number 24, that offers us instruction in a way that is more palatable to us. Fed 24, December 19th, 1787, it's not responding to Brutus 6 directly because that comes approximately a week later. This could possibly be responding to Federal Republican, a review of the Constitution from November 28th, 1787, but that stuff is really hard to tell. You have to say it offers a response to this letter, and we, the students of this stuff, have to piece that together. But Publius, nonetheless, is bald in saying, I've met with one specific objection. This is in the first paragraph of Fed 24. Proper provision has not been made against the existence of standing armies in times of peace, an objection which I shall now endeavor to show rests on weak and unsubstantial foundations. This objection supposedly turns on the necessity of restraining the legislative authority of the nation regarding military establishments. Publius says this principle is unheard of except in one or two of our state constitutions, and it's rejected in the remaining 11 or 12. So the concern about standing armies in times of peace is then concerns about how it is that we can restrain the legislature. Let me say this positively. The objection wants a positive statement in the Constitution that the legislature cannot establish a standing army. Publius's response is, this is bananas. This is unprecedented. And by the end of the day, we're going to see this is a dangerous, dangerous proposition. Hence his foil, the stranger to our politics in paragraph 3.
So the stranger to our politics would naturally be led, Publius says, to one or two conclusions. Either that the Constitution contained a positive injunction and standing armies should be kept up in time of peace, or that it vested in the executive the whole power of levying troops without subjecting his discretion in any shape to the control of the legislature. In other words, that the Constitution demanded a standing army outside the control of any branch except the executive, which presumably would appoint officials to head it, or that the decision to create an army was not subject to the separation of powers, particularly to the branch under the most direct popular control. So within the federal head, this is, and we should note that for now, Publius is dodging the question of whether the states ought to be involved. This is at the federal level within the Constitution. And so we're being pointed to the fact that this should be in control of the legislative, not the executive, and that it should in some ways be up to the discretion of branches operating within checks and balances. And he sets this up even without using these terms. It's just the political necessity of it is implied.
So it seems as if the anti-feds then, who would raise such an objection, are all over the place. It seems what the real experience has been in the various states and under the Articles of Confederation exists in a tension with their words regarding the Articles and standing armies. So there's a bit of confusion here. Publius shows us that the ability to raise a standing army is a legislative power, but it's checked by the fact that the legislature must reaffirm its commitment every 2 years. So it's not a permanent standing army. It's not as if it's just the executive, a prince or king, running around making this decision with his army at his own disposal. It's a real fun attack, I think, now that comes, because it's an attack on the motives of the anti-federalists. Publius has been dancing since Federalist Paper number 1 with motives, whether or not it's just or unjust, my words, to attack them. He says, we shouldn't go after motives, and then he goes after motives. He's back at attacking motives now in Fed 24. If this stranger to our politics, Aaron, quote, came afterwards to peruse the plan itself, he would be surprised to discover that neither the one nor the other was the case, that the whole power of raising armies was lodged in the legislature, not the executive, that this legislature was to be a popular body, consisting of the representatives of the people periodically elected, and that instead of the provision he had supposed in favor of standing armies, there was to be found in respect to this object an important qualification even of the legislative discretion, in that clause which forbids the appropriation of money for the support of an army for any longer period than 2 years. A precaution which, upon a nearer view of it, will appear to be a great and real security against military establishments without evident necessity. I love when Publius talks about great and real securities. He will use this language when he starts building securities against a problem, safeguards against a problem. And here we see the great and real security against military establishments exists in the need to reapportion money every 2 years or not. And also that needs to come out of the most popular branch, which itself has a cycle of 2 years. So it's close to the people. Look how democratic this is. You should already hear the word jealousy, suspicion. You should start hearing that being whispered right now as another component of citizens that's needed to keep us safe. Now, we need military to keep us safe. We need ourselves to have a watchful eye over the House, which itself should have a mind to this problem of standing militaries insofar as they might be used against our liberty. Tell me if you think I'm going too far. The final sentence of paragraph 4, wherein after the colon, Publius says, a precaution which, upon a nearer view of it, will appear to be a great and real security against military establishments without evident necessity. So that means if there is evident necessity, you must have military establishments. But if there's not evident necessity, you need security against military establishment. So Publius gives an inch here, admitting you don't want standing armies unless you have to have them. Now, what I think he's going to teach us is we have to have them. There is always going to be evident necessity. Golly, Machiavelli's back on the page yet again. Publius will offer us this lesson geographically, but not merely because of the Native Americans to our west, he will spend time on them, but also because we are to be a commercial nation. We're going to be on the Atlantic, and we've got Spain and Britain all around us. So necessity exists. I'm thinking here, for instance, of Prince 3. Beat up the line a little bit from Machiavelli in Prince 3, but it's something like, we should not abide by the words in the mouths of the wise men of our times to enjoy these peaceful times. Do you know this line that I mean? It's in Prince 3, towards the end, Machiavelli looks to the Romans. He says, look, the Romans understood what the wise men of our time do not understand. You must always prepare for war. And in fact, you must bring the war to your enemies rather than have them bring it to you. So I think Publius is going to adopt some of that thinking, but he gives an inch. Hey, a standing military when it's not needed is dangerous to your liberty, but maybe it's always needed. I think it's great. Does this seem right? What do you think of this?
And sure, and at the same time, he's pointing toward the overall soundness of the constitutional plan. If we go back to Federalist 9 and we think about the improvements in political science that are integrated into this Constitution, one of them is legislative checks and balances. That allows us to combine stability with frequent elections. So having a legislative elected every 2 years allows you to obviate concerns about the tax power, because you can just throw the bums out. Allows you to obviate concerns about the standing army, because you can throw the bums out. At the same time, you don't have to sacrifice the kind of stability that we're going to want when we look at papers 57, 61 for democratic control. You can have both. But right now, we're really leaning in to the notion that this is a popularly elected government. I don't think Publius wants us thinking of 6-term elected senators right now.
That's right. That's right. So much of this is an appeal to the people. This is a very democratic, popular paper. And then next paragraph 5, Publius attacks the declamation against the proposed constitution. He calls it a vehement and pathetic declamation. Surely the stranger to our politics is hearing this objection, must say it cannot be without some colorable pretext, especially because everyone's so jealous of their liberty here. Publius then does some comparative politics and turns to the state constitutions to say, here's how you all have been living under your state constitutions. So this novel federal constitution doesn't look that novel in this regard in comparison with the way you all are living under your states' constitutions. This starts in paragraph 6 of Federalist Paper 24. The several state constitutions, you see how great would be his disappointment to find that only 2 of them contained an interdiction of standing armies in times of peace. The other 11 had either observed a profound silence on the subject or had, in express terms, admitted the right of the legislature to authorize their existence. There must be something that these states understand. I think they understand necessity, and I think they understand means and ends and energy and power. For those are self-evident truths that Publius has hipped us to. I think these states understand it. You know, the self-evident truths that I'm talking about here, that you must give governments the energy if it's going to own up to its ends, so it must have these powers to raise an army, to tell it what to do. This is all rooted in that self-evident truth in Fed 23 of means and ends being proportionate. Who are these human beings in paragraph 7, Aaron? Did you see this? This is on the top of page 119 of our edition. This is the stranger to our politics is the he, but I'm wondering about these other cats. He would never be able to imagine, while any source of information remained unexplored, that it was nothing more than an experiment upon the public credulity, dictated either by a deliberate intention to deceive or by the overflowings of a zeal too intemperate to be ingenuous. It would probably occur to him that he would be likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. Here at length, he would expect to meet with a solution of the enigma. No doubt, he would observe to himself, the existing confederation must contain the most explicit provisions against military establishments in times of peace, and a departure from this model in favorite point has occasioned the discontent which appears to influence these political champions. Who are these men who either have a deliberate intention to deceive us, or they're zealous to the extent to be too intemperate to be ingenuous?
Well, we have a name for them derived from Federalist 10. They're a faction. They're a faction arrayed against the enduring common interest and, because of the necessity of a strong union, against our liberties. Of course,
So you think you're saying they're a faction because you think these people who are raising this objection are against the permanent and aggregate interests of the community?
That's right.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. Yeah. I was thinking you were just being mean, but you're using the source material. I see what you're saying.
Sure. He's not going to use the word here, but within the framework established by Publius, you think we would have to call them a faction, particularly because, while he says in Federalist 1 that often we err in decrying the motives of other people, he does so at points during this paper. He is not too shy to question people's motives. But that has nothing to do with our stranger to our politics right now. Only later, once the stranger to our politics peruses first the Constitution, and then the state constitutions, and then the Articles of Confederation, will he finally be able to do on his own part to sound the motives of the people who are leading him to strange conclusions. If you look in paragraph 8, we are presented with two kinds of deliberators. If he happened to be a man of quick sensibility or ardent temper, he could now no longer refrain from pronouncing these clamors to be the dishonest artificers of a sinister and unprincipled opposition to a plan which ought at least to receive a fair and candid examination from all sincere lovers of their country. I have an exclamation point there.
Yeah.
How else, he would say, could the authors of them have been tempted to vent such loud censures upon that plan about a point in which it seems to have conformed itself to the general sense of America, as declared in its different forms of government, and in which it has even superadded a new and powerful guard unknown to any of them? So a man quick to be thrown from extreme to extreme would find himself at first enraged by the notion that the Constitution contained no great security against a standing army. Having learned that that was not all the case, would now aim that same invective against the people who made that claim, against the anti-federalists, not the federalists.
So if we went back to the characterizations offered in paragraph 7, this person of temper would have to say, those anti-federalists have a deliberate intention to deceive me. Because all I have to do is look at the Articles of Confederation, and I see no such prohibition as the objectors are clamoring for against standing armies in times of peace. That's what Publius has established thus far. This is some real soaring rhetoric now, this type of person, but there's another type of person in paragraph 8, I believe. Did you see this next person? If, on the contrary,
he happened to be a man of calm and dispassionate feelings, he would indulge a sigh for the frailty of human nature, and would lament that in a matter so interesting to the happiness of millions, the true merits of the question should be perplexed and obscured by expedients so unfriendly to an impartial and right determination. Even such a man could hardly forbear remarking that a conduct of this kind has too much the appearance of an intention to mislead the people by alarming their passions, rather than to convince them by arguments addressed to their understandings. So the dispassionate man is not himself ignorant to the passions of others. He stands aside and looks at the anti-federalists misleading and whipping up the passions of the great mass of people. The question I think you and I have to ask ourselves is, who are we? Are we the passionate deliberator who maybe cannot be said to be deliberating at all, but who instead is just thrown from side to side by the demagogue? Or are we the person who can sigh at the frailty of human nature and wish instead for a more candid debate, which would require to do what Publius has taught us to do so far, which is look at the precedents, look at the Constitution, which we have before us, look at the state constitutions that exist, look at the Articles of Confederation that operate. If you do that, you realize, at least so in this examination, that the anti-federalists are pulling our leg. If we do that, now we've come to the opinion that the Constitution, at least on this ground, it deserves to be investigated with an open mind. And this is where the paper turns, because we're now going to consider whether the provision for a standing army, which is in this Constitution, is actually choice-worthy. But we see how much legwork has to be done to get us to this point. We need to be taught how to read the Constitution in light of the existing constitutions that we have, in light of the sense of America, and in light of one of our favorite words, necessity.
Yeah, necessity. Well, I really appreciate the way that you've framed this, Aaron. So you're showing us how Publius is teaching us the matter at hand through an objection. And at the same time that he's addressing the objection, he's addressing the motives of the objectors, the anti-federalists. I've now come to wonder about the anti-feds and whether they have a deliberate intention to deceive me or just are mistaken in misleading me. So that's still a question, but either which way, I don't trust them. What am I to do with Publius, who, as we would say today, is showing the receipts? Trust him. He's invited me into the matter himself. Look at the Articles of Confederation and look at your state constitutions. This argument against the Constitution is bananas. So I'm now open to Publius in a way and closed off to the anti-feds in a way. It's brilliant. I really appreciate the argument you've advanced, Aaron, on this point. Necessity. Paragraph 9 of Federalist 24 announces necessity. Publius wants to move closer to this argument, take a closer view of it, even though I think he's eviscerated it already at this point. He says, from a close examination, it will appear that restraints upon the discretion of the legislature in respect to military establishments would be improper to be imposed, and if imposed, from the necessities of society, would be unlikely to be observed. So Publius is now offering us an education in the goodness of having a legislature that may establish a standing army in times of peace. Why? Because of necessity. And here what we'll see is even if we were to make a parchment barrier that prohibited the legislature from doing this, the necessities of society would have us going against that parchment barrier. That constitutional provision is not worth the paper it would be printed on, because necessity is the great engine that drives human behavior here. Foremost, don't be so confident that you're just going to enjoy peace. This is again why I'm thinking of that paragraph towards the end of Machiavelli Prince chapter 3. Look, everything's fine. It's safe here right now. No one's attacking us. Why do we need to prepare for war? Publius in paragraph 10 of Fed 24 says, look, various considerations warn us against an excess of confidence or security. Britain, Spain, all this stuff regarding the West India Islands, the Native Americans on our western frontier. He says they ought to be regarded as, quote, our natural enemies. Finally, towards the bottom, after speaking of the problems between France and Spain, he says, politicians have ever, with great reason, considered the ties of blood as feeble and precarious links of political connection. These circumstances combined admonish us not to be too sanguine in considering ourselves as entirely out of reach of danger. So no matter how friendly France might be today, we shouldn't anticipate that tomorrow. No matter what's going on between France and Spain today, we should be preparing for war. There's a baseline understanding that these hostilities are going to come. Dangers and threats exist. Here's a way that you've been thinking about the Federalist Papers a lot. I mean, Publius taught you this, Aaron. You think that this thing is the danger. Actually, not doing it is the true danger. Then by reminding us that war seems to be inevitable, to quote that wonderful movie, In the Loop, it's more dangerous to have constitutional prohibitions against the legislature raising a standing army. He continues, small garrisons are needed on the frontier. It's necessary to have them. Just because the Native Americans have not attacked today doesn't mean they won't tomorrow. And then once you have those garrisons, you have to have people manning them lest you lose them. So any state that's enjoying a western frontier needs to maintain that through martial force. He says, permanent corps in the pay of the government is needed there. It amounts to a standing army in time of peace. A small one indeed, but not the less real for being small. He will add to it commerce. So not merely just the danger of violence and being overrun in a piece of property, but also you're going to have trade with the Native American nations. Therefore, you have to have people there to do it at these posts, these garrisons.
We start to see here develop what's going to come in the next paper. In the paragraph about the garrisons to protect us from Native Americans, that there is a necessity for a professionalized force. Part of the reason that you have to have this professionalized force is so that the standing army concentrates at the federal level, not at the state level where militias are called up. We're going to see this expanded. And one of the things that I thought I'd bring up here is it seems that paper number 24 ends more abruptly than what we're used to. Number 25 is called The Same Subject Continued, to be sure. It is meant as a continuation, but it ends with this point that if we're mean to be a commercial people, we have to have a navy. It is insufficient for us to have garrisons by the coast. Commerce and security go hand in hand, partially because we have a moat to our east. We ought not to think that that moat is a perfect security. He says the world in some ways is getting smaller. And of course, we have more to be worried about than what's directly across the Atlantic. The West Indies, the Caribbean, those, of course, present wonderful bases from which to attack America as they were used during the Revolutionary War. But we pick up in paper number 25 in the first and second paragraphs with a reminder of our security risks. The territories of Britain, Spain, and of the Indian nations in our neighborhood do not border on particular states. They encircle the Union from Maine to Georgia. The danger, though in different degrees, is therefore common, and the means of guarding against it ought in like manner to be the objects of common councils and of a common treasury. So one of the reasons why it's expedient to put the military, the standing army, in the federal control is that it allows you broadly to think about what kind of force is necessary to meet them. We're a commercial people. That means that the seafaring states have an interest in a navy. Now, the states that are not seafaring, let's say the southern ones, this is a seaboard country at this point. Of course, it will not be soon, but you think about the west of Virginia or the west of Massachusetts. Their interest has to be tied to that of the coast. So the national, having a national standing army, thinking about military and security from a national perspective, then allows you to think comprehensively about what kind of force is needed. So we'll say a navy, because we need to be commercial, because the West and the East are going to be linked by commerce. And commerce and security, as I said, go hand in hand. But now we're thinking about what kind of force is necessary for our security risks, and thinking about that in common, he says, is necessary. And so we see as we go on through 25, what kind of force we need.
Just as a small aside, regarding what you see as abrupt ending of Federalist 24, Federalist 24 is published on December 19th. Federalist 25 is published on December 21st. So the continuity is undeniable. Same subject continued. Yes, most certainly.
Are we having too much fun to imagine Hamilton, or Publius, rather, whoever he is, dashing this off to the press and then getting back to his desk again, having met a deadline?
I mean, I'll leave that one to you. I don't know. I'll leave that
speculation, to you. But certainly no Christmas break for him.
Yeah. So look, you've offered us the transition into 25, but I want to say the following, at least about 24, before we really get deep into 25. Look, if we want to have the Union, which we definitely want to have, if we've been convinced, then we want to tie the hands of the legislature, but we also want to rely on their prudence and their discretion. So we want to tie their hands at the same time that we're empowering them. Yes, the legislature can raise standing armies in times of peace, and I'm going to have to rely on its prudence and its discretion. It's deciding that it can do this, that it can raise a standing army. And look, it's going to have one all the time, no matter how small, in these garrisons on the western side of the frontier, and then wherever on the eastern seaboard because of this navy. dockyards, and so on and so forth he discusses there. So what I want to put a button on now is, hey, look, necessity requires you to have a standing army, but keep a lookout for a legislature that's going to give you a standing army when necessity doesn't require it. What we now can see at the end of 24 is that geographical necessity, along with human nature on the western frontier, requires a standing army. And then human nature, our desire to be commercial entities, to say nothing also of human nature and the dangers that will be posed by Britain and Spain, require us to have a navy, which means that we're going to have to equip that navy. And I believe the navy is mentioned along with the army in Fed 23 in terms of powers that the government must have. And I want to be a commercial people. I know you want to be a commercial people too. So we have to have the means to the end of being able to be commercial people. Now, what's interesting is that Publius doesn't say much, if anything, about the commander-in-chief. He speaks about the executive early on regarding the objections, but he doesn't say anything about the commander-in-chief. I think he's hiding that energy that is needed in the executive. In Fed 24, instead, he speaks of this house that's so close to the people, and he speaks of 2 years. So he's hiding even how Republican it is. It seems so very democratic in that way. But while he might be hiding components of Republican government in the legislature, he's definitely hiding our executive a bit. Let me be very clear. There's no question of who guides this army and this navy. I think that would be an interesting concern to have, but he doesn't need to address that right now. He's been so focused on this objection regarding standing armies in times of peace. Publius, therefore, keeps the attention on the legislature and away from something that might start looking like a king.
I think he is very explicit in 24 about the objection he's addressing. Here in the second paragraph, it's less explicit, but it's something that is going to be raised by our friend Patrick Henry at the Virginia ratifying conventions. Henry questions whether there actually is a necessity for a new constitution, which is, he says this: there was a rebellion in Massachusetts that's much publicized, but that rebellion was in Massachusetts. It wasn't in Virginia. And Publius, in some ways, gives a little bit of ground to this kind of objection. Of course, Henry could not have made it yet, because this occurs before the ratifying convention in Virginia. We are writing 25, as you said, in December of 1787. It happens, he says, that some states from local situation are more directly exposed to danger. New York is of this class. So New York, absent some kind of standing army under a federal control, would have to raise her own army to be able to protect against dangers. Of course, then the smaller states, or the states that are less directly exposed, are going to be leery of the New York standing army. And so they're going to have to raise their own forces. And all of a sudden, again, thinking about this kind of argumentation that you brought up that I like to point out that Publius does, now, because we don't have a national standing army that's capable of meeting these threats, or at least the provision for a national standing army capable of meeting these threats, we found our way to either a standing army in every single state, or of the possibility of a New York running roughshod over the liberties of the other states. So we've arrived at this point, whether we want it or not, so that it becomes a problem then of coordination. Do we want every state having their own standing army, or do we want the provision within the national legislature to be used or not according to discretion and necessity as those things interact, to have that in operation? He says, if we do not have this ability to have the standing army, then we will end up with one in every single state in the country, just because of the way that jealousy and the passions are inflamed by fear.
Paragraph 3 is fantastic on everything you've just brought to our attention, Aaron. I'd like to read a little bit and discuss it. Paragraph 3 of Federalist paper number 25, Publius says, reasons have been already given to induce a supposition that the state governments will too naturally be prone to a rivalship with that of the Union, the foundation of which will be the love of power, and that in any contest between the federal head and one of its members, the people will be most apt to unite with their local government. Okay, so the love of power is going to have a struggle between each state and the federal government. If in addition to this immense advantage, the ambition of the members should be stimulated by the separate and independent possession of military forces, it would afford too strong a temptation and too great facility to them to make enterprises upon and finally to subvert the constitutional authority of the Union. Okay, so here's the problem. If you have these states that have their own standing armies, they are going to overturn the federal government and therewith the Union. We don't want that because we've been arguing for paper after paper the Union itself as necessary for our security. So standing armies as a state responsibility, 13 separate standing armies, is going to undermine the Union. We saw this in Federalist 8, and now we're seeing it again here in 25. Ambition and love of power rest in the hearts of all men and therefore in the states themselves, I would say. On the other hand, Publius continues, the liberty of the people would be less safe in this state of things than in that which left the national forces in the hands of the national government. This is really interesting. Why is it more dangerous to liberty to have local standing armies in my state than a national, federal standing army? Here's Publius's argument. As far as an army may be considered as a dangerous weapon of power, it had better be in those hands of which the people are most likely to be jealous than in those of which they are least likely to be so. For it is a truth, which the experience of all ages has attested, that the people are commonly most in danger when the means of injuring their rights are in the possession of those of whom they entertain the least suspicion. Jealousy and suspicion are here linked. This is why I said back there in Fed 24, you can start to hear whispers of jealousy and suspicion. These are virtues. We are to be jealous of our liberty, which is to say, I don't want anyone endangering it. I baby it and take care of it. And in addition, therefore, I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious of anyone or any institution, which is filled with human beings, that might rob me of my liberty. And Publius's argument here is, you're not suspicious of your neighbor in the same way you're suspicious of that person who lives far away from you. The people local to you are not the object of your suspicion as much as those people who are far away from you. An argument that Brutus made, that we would not at all have any idea what the federal government is doing because it's far away and it's not going to therefore be responsible, Publius has flipped on its head and said, actually, that it's a federal government with a standing army is a virtue because somehow it's going to, what's the way to say this, enact your jealousy gland in a way that a state standing army will not. There's some Publian judo if I've ever seen it. He's flipped the argument again. So you need a standing army. Do you agree? Yes. Okay. But I want it in my state. No, you don't. Because that's more dangerous to your liberty for several reasons. My favorite one right here. Every standing army is dangerous. Just because it's local doesn't mean it's safe. What a devastating attack on all of the anti-federalist arguments that say the only way to keep government responsible is by keeping it local. Publius says you are not going to have the Republican virtue of jealousy and suspicion that you need to have if your government is only local. Therefore, enlarging the orbit has now an added virtue about it that I didn't quite understand back there in Fed 10. Isn't that neat? Well, let me just say one more thing then. So what you and I have to understand as a matter of real politic here is that the love of power occupies us all. It would drive the states to rivalship. First with the federal government and then with each other. The states aren't exempt from these rules, these laws, these truths that apply between governments themselves. So it's not as if the states aren't going to behave as a prince, as Britain's going to behave, or as Spain is going to behave. What a hard-nosed lesson being offered here by Machiavelli. Oh, I mean Publius, excuse me. Just a joke a little bit. Go ahead, Aaron, I'm sorry.
This lesson of why we ought to fear what's in our own backyard flows nicely into his education about the dangers of the militia. Because having once understood that our local institutions can be the source of depredations to our liberty, we may have our ears more open toward a criticism of the beloved American institution, and that the one that we might think, if we were not attuned to the history of the recent revolution, won us our independence. We're thinking now about true foundations for our liberty and our security. You noted earlier that Publius brings in this language, be better educated about what will achieve our security and our liberty.
So become educated in the fact that there is such a thing as jealousy as a virtue and suspicion as a virtue. Low trust in people who wield power is not a vice in certain situations. I'd like to be able to trust my barber, to borrow from that line from Spider-Man. And I'd also like to be able to trust the airline pilot. But I tell you, with these guys, you've got to keep a watchful eye over them. And Publius is reminding us of that. Look at paragraph 5 of Federalist paper number 25 as well, before we get to the malicious. There are other views besides those already presented, in which the impropriety of restraints on the discretion of the national legislature will be equally manifest. So restraining the legislature's ability to raise standing armies in times of tranquility would be to act with impropriety. The design of the objection, which has been mentioned, is to preclude standing armies in times of peace, though we have never been informed how far it is desired the prohibition should extend, whether to raising armies as well as to keeping them up in a season of tranquility or not. If it be confined to the latter, it will have no precise signification, and it will be ineffectual for the purpose intended. So you need to be able to raise them and keep them up. Publius is now building the argument for professionalized military. So while I said let's not rush straight to militias, but this is the argument against militias. I don't want you to be a farmer one day and in the army the next day.
Well, and necessity will require that we have these forces anyway. If we have a provision that prevents us from keeping up a standing army, he asks, when armies are raised, what shall be denominated keeping them up, contrary to the sense of the Constitution? What time shall be requisite to ascertain the violation? Shall it be a week, a month, or a year? Or shall we say that they may be continued as long as the danger which occasioned their being raised continues? This would be to admit that they might be kept in time of peace, against threatening or impending danger, which would be at once to deviate from the literal meaning of the prohibition and to introduce an extensive latitude of construction. Who shall be judge of the continuance of the danger? This must undoubtedly be submitted to the national government, and the matter would then be brought to this issue. The national government, to provide against apprehended danger, might in the first instance raise troops, and might afterwards keep them on foot, as long as they supposed the peace or safety of the community was in any danger of jeopardy. Is it easy to perceive that a discretion so latitudinary as this would afford ample room for eluding the force of the provision? So we would find the necessity of interpreting these provisions against the literal meaning without necessarily destroying the provision. Yet that kind of bending, while necessary, means that we're in some real way violating the Constitution. So it would be improper, it would be against the spirit of the Constitution to write a provision in such a way that it would need, because of the course of events, to be violated. It would happen. It would happen. And then we have a whole host of other issues to worry about once we're admitting the necessity of bending the Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution itself must have the prudence to deal with necessity in this way. Otherwise, it undermines itself of it, which is needed for its perpetuation. Did you catch this language of the gathering storm in paragraph 7 of Fed 25? I will confess I do not know who first tied those words together, but it was nice to see here. There is always a gathering storm, Publius, I think, would allow me to say. If to obviate the consequence of the possibility of the legislature and the executive combining to usurp the people's liberties by way of their deployment of the standing armies, one would prohibit the raising of armies in times of peace, Publius says, the U.S. would then exhibit the most extraordinary spectacle which the world has yet seen, that of a nation incapacitated by its constitution to prepare for defense before it was actually invaded. So that's like cutting off your arm because you're worried you're going to get cancer in that arm. Like there's a possibility. My dad had pancreatic cancer. Let's go ahead and get my pancreas out of my body. What? You kind of need that thing. How do I say this? Publius is trying to show us something like jealousy rightly understood. And jealousy rightly understood here is tempered by our own prudence. and the necessity of having a legislature that can raise a standing army at its own discretion in light of necessity. Publius has already taught us in Federalist 24 that we have necessity to the west and to the east of us. So the legislature must have this discretion. And guess what? You keep it safe every 2 years by your voting the House in or out, and also the House itself deciding what it's doing with the budget, the purse. But right now, what we're being convinced of is the necessity of having this sword. The purse is to come. So we have to understand that militias involve people bringing even their families with them out on campaign. Militias were sort of ragtag. It's remarkable that they worked. Publius's contempt for militias is dripping off the page. It's hard to keep them together. It's a miracle that we won the Revolutionary War. It's remarkable that any militia could really do much. Because for Publius, the storms are real, and there is a science of war. And militias are ignorant of that science. He argues in paragraph 8, the steady operations of war against a regular and disciplined army can only be successfully conducted by a force of the same kind. So I guess we're lucky you get an aide-de-camp named Hamilton and a man named George Washington and a huge landmass, and maybe it can work out in your favor. But we shouldn't found a country and ratify a constitution relying on such good fortune. Instead, we should rely on science. Publius ends this paragraph number 8. War, like most other things, is a science to be acquired and perfected by diligence, by perseverance, by time, and by practice. So this means that the army must always exist. The Navy must always exist. It must always be practicing, and its science developing. This is what's necessary. To have any constitutional provision prohibiting the legislature from having a standing army during times of peace would be the death of this Constitution.
And he ties this back into our discussion of the state constitutions earlier, and in bringing to bear the danger of writing a provision in the Constitution that would have to be ignored. Gathering storm may be a phrase familiar to us. Here's one I've never read before. Violent policy.
Thank you so much. This is great. Yeah, go ahead.
All violent policy, contrary to the natural and experienced course of human affairs, defeats itself. Look what he says. Pennsylvania has, in the Bill of Rights of that state, a declaration that standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be kept up in a time of peace. Publius notes in a footnote in number 24, the previous paper, that that is not a prohibition, but a caution. Fine. Pennsylvania, nevertheless, in a time of profound peace from the existence of partial disorders in one or two of her counties, has resolved to raise a body of troops, and in all probability will keep them up as long as there is any appearance of danger to the public peace. So, too, did Massachusetts, was compelled to raise troops to quell a domestic insurrection, and still keeps a corps in pay to prevent a revival of the spirit of revolt. So you can have these parchment barriers. It will be necessary to overrun them when the rubber meets the road. This experience, he says, teaches us, in its application to the United States, how little the rights of a feeble government are likely to be respected, even by its own constituents. And it teaches us, in addition to the rest, how unequal parchment provisions are to a struggle with public necessity. So a written constitution, Mike, is so important, and it's so important to get it right, to be able to balance government and protect our liberties. But we also realize that it cannot meet with every single occasion. And so it's necessary to put prudence, to put discretion into the Constitution. Here, we don't even need to have a very wide latitude to the legislative to be able to arrange that, or even to the executive. We're not there yet. All we need to do is not tie their hands. A prohibition of funding after 2 years, fine. That's pretty good. But we need to be able to give the legislative the power to raise a standing professional army. And here we might even forget we're talking about a standing professional army, right? He's moved on back to a discussion of the states, which allows for this really interesting ending. And I think probably is quoting from Herodotus or Thucydides. Where are we? We're in the Peloponnesian War.
Very end. Before we get to this ending, let me say that this violent policy, this is again the way Publius, what I've called as judo. what you've been pointing out so many times, the way he's flipping this over. We know feeble governments are not long for this world. So what's the violent policy here? Is it having a standing army? No. The violent policy is not having an army during times of peace, not having a professional army, not having a professional navy. That's the violence. That's the true violence. I love this way that Publius does this. I'm worried about having these guys with guns around me during standing times. They're going to do violence to me. Not having them is going to do violence to you. It's going to do violence to the Union and violence to the Constitution. Britain's going to be back. Spain's going to be here. Native Americans on the West are threatening us, Publius says repeatedly. There's true violence, so don't do violence to yourself. And then finally, as you said in the closing paragraph here, he offers us an ancient example of this folly of making constitutional provisions against having strength in your government. In this case, this is involving that Spartan, that Lacedaemonian named Lysander. Now here in Sparta, you could not have the same person be admiral twice. Publius says, well, necessity forced the Lacedaemonians to take up a, quote, flimsy subterfuge. They needed Lysander to save them. They needed him to be admiral. So they gave him the nominal title of vice admiral and invested him with full powers. This instance is selected from a multitude that might be cited, says Publius. This is a common mistake by human beings. They try and constrain human beings by constraining government through their written constitution, but in fact, they've made no actual constraints that can last because they do not account for necessity. Publius continues, nations pay little regard to rules and maxims calculated in their very nature to run counter to the necessities of society. Wise politicians will be cautious about fettering the government with restrictions that cannot be observed, because they know that every breach of the fundamental laws, though dictated by necessity, that sacred reverence which ought to be maintained in the breast of rulers towards the constitution of a country and forms a precedent for other breaches where the same plea of necessity does not exist at all or is less urgent and palpable. Now, you might be thinking of something like Jeff Toulis's rhetorical presidency, but I would say you should just be thinking of Machiavelli. You know, all honor to Toulis, but I think you should be thinking of Machiavelli here. In this case, it's recognizing what necessity dictates, and something else that necessity dictates, not merely having the army to keep you safe from your foes. Something else that necessity dictates here is understanding that people must revere the Constitution. That's what now has been established. And in order to revere the Constitution, it must persist. It can't be broken all the time. This is your argument, Aaron. It's Publius's argument. It's my argument. Therefore, you must have provisions in the Constitution to raise standing armies in times of peace or tranquility, to provide for a navy. And you must have this stuff because you want to be safe, and the states themselves are not capable of doing this. You need union, and you need the Constitution that's capable of presiding over the union with the energy and powers capable of preserving us in liberty and also as we grow as a commercial power and a military power. So that's what's also here now. Commercial and military power seem to be peas in a pod. Is that not true? You're going to have a navy, and you're going to have a military on the other frontier, on the west, if you want to be commercial. So it's no matter if the Native Americans and the Americans are hostile towards each other at this point in time. Even if they're trading, you have to have garrisons which are staffed, he argues. And especially when it comes to the Navy, you must. So wise rulers understand this. The breach of the fundamental laws will impair that sacred reverence of the Constitution that is necessary for the Constitution to persist. To do otherwise would pave the way for the continuous undermining of the Constitution itself, especially for spurious reasons. And then you no longer have a Constitution capable of keeping you secure. You have something like the rule of one or few, instead of the rule of the many who have ratified the Constitution which both empowers and constrains their representatives. I think Fed 24 and 25 are pretty awesome. I love the rhetoric. I love the Machiavellianism of it. I am buying into this here Constitution.
The figure that we were talking about earlier, who was hidden in all this, the commander-in-chief himself receives an education at the end of this essay. Wise politicians, you said, will be cautious about fettering the government with restrictions that cannot be observed, because they know that every breach of the fundamental laws, though dictated by necessity, impairs that sacred reverence which ought to be maintained not in the people, right, not in the Republican citizens who are going to be binded by this, but the rulers themselves.
That's right.
And so the commander-in-chief there emerges as having been in some ways cautioned or restrained, educated through this essay.
Yes, here it is that we're actually constraining our representatives by way of the reverence they have for the Constitution, which they take an oath to protect. And so if the Constitution itself does not have the necessary provisions for your securing of the Constitution, why are you reverent for as the Constitution? The Constitution has to empower you to take care of the Constitution itself. Yeah, so in education then. So the people have received an education in 24 and 25 regarding their suspicion and jealousy and what I've called the virtue. And then in addition, in the necessity of standing armies and why it is that this cannot be taken care of in the state level. And then now you're saying the executive and probably also the legislators are receiving an education. What about also those politicians, if I may use that word, called the anti-feds? Well, I'm not sure that they're listening, but at least that stranger to our politics has received an education, and the citizens have. So ratify, vote yes. That's the way I'll end all of these conversations.
Vote yes. That's going to be our merch.
Yeah, that's going to be our merch. Hey, Aaron, it was great seeing you.
Thanks,
I can't
Mike.
wait to talk with you again about some Federalist papers.
Yeah. See you later.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.